Good afternoon, everyone. You are truly the bold, the brave, and the true. This is the last session of this conference, and my role again is to introduce the moderator. I will refrain from saying anything about my racial identity in this particular session. The moderator of this session needs no introduction. It is Sean Noriega. He's a professor of film, television, and digital media here at UCLA, and he also, as many of you know, directs the Chicano Studies Research Center. He has a diverse and robust scholarly agenda, which includes the book Shot in America, Television, the States, and Chicano Cinema. He's a prolific writer. He's written 40 book chapters or journals or media policy reports, including a 3-part study on hate speech as it's manifested on talk radio. He's currently completing a longitudinal study looking at online and social media strategies among nearly 180 museums. In this respect, I think it's helpful to say that Professor Noriega's work is both deeply theoretical on the one hand, asking foundational questions about what is art, what is culture, what is media, and on the other hand, deeply concerned about the conditions under which art and culture is produced. This helps to explain why he is the adjunct curator at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art and why he is the co-founder of the National Association of Latino Independent Producers. He serves on numerous boards and has won too many awards for me to list them. All of this to say he is well situated, it seems to me, to moderate this session on cultural production and superdiversity. Please join me in welcoming Professor Noriega.
Thank you, Devon. And I want to just echo what he said in more colloquial terms. As we're going through this panel and shifting the focus towards cultural production, just realize with each speaker that we are what stands between you and a glass of wine. We understand that, we appreciate it, and we look forward to joining you. But I think it's really important to be able to bring some focus to the arena of cultural production. I'm, as they say on television, not just a moderator, also I'm listed as one of the panelists, which I didn't quite appreciate until about 2 weeks ago when I actually read the lineup. But what we want to do here in terms of really kicking this term around the way we have in the last 24 hours of Superdiversity is bring that from some of the discussions that relate to the historical frameworks, but also the material and political frameworks and legal frameworks within which this term has some potential in terms of its usefulness, but to bring it to the issue of cultural production as well, which is oftentimes the kind of the last thing that is taken up as a consideration within many of these other arenas, and hopefully this will help shift that. The focus on superdiversity is itself an attempt to reframe away from, say, the issue of numbers counting, which is still very important, within a number of the sociological registers for participation and control and ownership, to one of reframing the totality that is itself the arena of participation and the object of study. What I'd like to do, rounding out Devon's introduction, is to briefly introduce our other speakers and then dive in with fairly brief comments on my part as an attempt to kind of frame this, and then we'll go on and to our next speaker, who will be Renee Tajima Pena, since she'll be showing some media, so this will be a chance for you to engage with cultural production, and then we'll follow our list in the schedule. Our first speaker will be Renee Tajima Pena, after me, so actually our second speaker, who is listed here as a professor of social documentary film and video at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Now, last night, Eric Avila was outed as a historian, and I'd like to out Renee as a potentially, hopefully, please, one of our colleagues here at UCLA in the near future. Now, she is an Academy Award-winning film director, producer whose work focuses on Asian American diaspora, immigrant communities, and media and social change. And as my notes say here, her phone number is 310. Sorry. She is the director of a large number of films. I think we're all familiar with Who Killed Vincent Chin. One of my favorites is My America, or Honk If You Love Buddha. More recently, Calavera Highway. And she is working with Virginia Espino and the Center for Oral History Research here on a project called Mas Bebes, which is looking at the coercive sterilization of Mexican-American women in Los Angeles in the 1970s at the LA County USC Medical Center. And that's a project that, for which the Chicano Studies Library has important archival holdings, and we've been delighted to work with her and Virginia on this project as they develop it. Our next speaker will be Robin Kelly, who is Gary Nash Endowed Chair in United States History and a Distinguished Professor of History at UCLA. Also a UCLA grad some time back. His teaching and research interests focus on American and African American history, with a particular emphasis on radical social movements and the political dynamics at work within African American culture, including jazz, hip hop, and visual arts. He's the author of numerous books, more recently, not most recently, Thelonious Monk, Life and Times of an American Original. And I think that subtitle itself speaks to some of what we've been trying to do here through this conference. Finally, last but not least, Rebecca Sosi, who is sitting in the front. She will not be on the dais because of the lighting, but will be up here as our final speaker. Is a Regents Professor at Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University. She teaches in areas of Indian law, property, bioethics, critical race theory, as well as seminars in international indigenous rights, and in the college's Tribal Policy Law and Government Master of Law program. And she is with Carol Goldberg and I think one or two others, co-author of American Indian Law, Native Nations, and the Federal System. So what I'd like to do now is give a brief presentation that's actually divided into two even briefer presentations. So basically two 500-word papers. The former hopefully exemplifying what I'm going to present in a more conceptual register in the second half. And it's part of kind of a thinking through of my own efforts to engage in something along the lines of superdiversity as a logic for both scholarship and participation in the arena of cultural production and exhibition. And so the first one is actually something that should be posting on Huffington Post later today or tomorrow or never. Actually, I'm a blogger there, but I've been waiting for it to kind of show up. And it's also a version is circulating through our newsletter, which went out today. So I'm going to read this, and then I'm going to talk through in the second component kind of where this is coming from and what I hope it exemplifies, because the piece itself is not kind of hanging the theory in front of what I'm trying to do. It's a conundrum, to be sure. What do you do when your longtime maid dies? After all, she practically raised your children. She cooked your eggs just so, lightly sprinkling them with something red. You asked her what, but you could not make out her response. It sounded like tapas. So, do you send flowers to her family? Did she even have a family? Do you mention it in your year-end letter to friends and relatives? After all, she worked for you almost 40 years. These are delicate matters. It is what makes life in Hollywood so very challenging. In 1976, Lupe Ontiveros earned her first role in Hollywood. She played a maid on Charlie's Angels. Over the next 36 years, she played, by her own account, more than 150 maids, holding her own against the likes of Jack Nicholson twice. When she was not playing a maid, she played a prostitute or a madam. But she was also what I call the patron saint of Chicano and Latino cinema, starring in now classic films, Zoot Suit, El Norte, Born in East LA, My Family, and The Earth Did Not Swallow Him, Selena, Chuck and Buck, Luminarias, and Real Women Have Curves. She had recurring roles in just about every Chicano-produced television series, and also Desperate Housewives. My personal favorite is her role as a drug lord in Taylor Hackford's 1993 film Blood In, Blood Out. Without a doubt, her final shootout scene is matched in American cinema only by Queen Latifah's in Set It Off. Lupe lived large on the silver screen. Now, Ontiveros passed away in July 2012 at age 69, much too early to be sure. Yet, she had an astounding career, especially in light of the limited roles available for Latino actors. Why, she even did voice work in an episode of Seth MacFarlane's Family Guy. So imagine my surprise when the Oscars did not include her in the In Memoriam section. Yeah. The Oscars also snubbed Russell Means, Sherman Hemsley, and Phyllis Diller. These oversights took place during an Oscar ceremony that one writer in The Nation called a lengthy celebration of xenophobia and misogyny. Another writer in The Atlantic noted, the more we pass off old stereotypes rooted in hate as normal, as MacFarlane did again and again last night, the longer these stereotypes and their ability to harm people will be in place. Now, in the fallout for this, the Academy took the brunt of the blame, since its membership, similar to the declining viewership for the Oscar broadcast itself, is older. The average Academy member is 62. It's not seeming so old these days, but less younger. Almost entirely white, 94% white, and mostly male, 77% male. The rationale for having MacFarlane as the host had to do with reaching a younger audience, which he did. The 18 to 49 demographic, that audience went up 11%. But the strategy relied heavily on what one writer called, in Salon.com, the ironic hipster self-aware racism of being so cool that we know it's racist, but it's okay to participate in it. We're above it. Indeed, two Hollywood notables in the coveted 18 to 49 demographic received Oscars for creative work rooted in some form of racial masquerade: Quentin Tarantino and Ben Affleck. Of course, such an approach overlooks the fact that non-whites made up more than half of all births and accounted for 92% of population growth between 2000 and 2010. So these are delicate matters indeed. Now, earlier this week, the Academy quietly added Lupe Ontiveros to its online In Memoriam page. Now, in trying to frame this, I want to start with the idea that superdiversity is a way of rejecting and reframing contemporary popular and critical discourses about American culture. American is in quotation marks there. In many ways, identity and then diversity emerged as the cultural compromise for another word expressed as a demand within the three branches of government: equity. That said, I do not want to play into a simple dichotomy between recognition and redistribution, since these are deeply entwined social concepts. Even today, as my account of the Lupe Ontiveros incident indicates, stereotypes remain the primary mechanism by which marginalized groups are able to engage demands for minority employment, creative control, and ownership within the creative industries. Put in other terms, if redistribution is the strategy, recognition is the necessary tactic. Now, part of why this is an issue has to do with a misunderstanding about politics, and hence the mechanisms for social change. So I want to start with the assertion that politics is not a transparent and unmediated arena for human action, whether you base it on rational choice of the individual or the down and dirty horse trading between interest groups. We do have both of these as dominant notions of politics. They both rely on a certain level of unmediated action. Instead, what I want to argue is that cultural production, that politics is the cultural production par excellence. The arenas within which such politics occur, the economic structure, the status order, and the state apparatus are constructs that are beyond the control of the individual human subject or even a particular group, no matter how vested. And these arenas are imbued with profound contradictions quite similar to those of the unconscious and language. They are not mere obstacles, as some social theorists would argue, to participatory parity, egalitarian redistribution, and actual existing democracy. And part of what makes this very difficult as either an advocate, activist, or as a scholar is that it sort of removes the issue of agency. It's not that there isn't agency. We all have agency within the drama of that politics, but there is no author. And I think that once we grapple with that, it really changes what our responsibilities are, what the ethics of what we do is. Now, in my own research, I focus on Chicano cinema and Chicano art. And I'd be the first to acknowledge that in some ways these are now historical categories. But they've become historical without a corresponding end to categorical exclusion of the people to whom these terms refer. So to that extent, they remain necessary and viable categories. Now, in both cases, Chicano cultural expression emerges in the 1960s out of the activities involving key figures, men, women, gay and straight, whether recognized at that time, but also key figures from other racial and ethnic groups, and also government agencies, corporations, the business sector, mass media, and so on. While the resulting work, the Chicano work, itself is equally engaged with a global set of aesthetic practices and social references. This does not discount the exclusionary practices, critical biases, police violence, and ethnic conflicts, gender conflicts, homophobia, that were taking place at that time, and not just by one side of a conflict that you may identify. But it does allow us to narrate a history of so-called Chicano expression that is not so much an outside addendum to a dominant historical record, as it is a different way of writing about American cultural production in the period. So part of the method of this, I think, is that when we're telling our stories, and at the end of the day, a lot of times what we are doing is telling our story. And we tell it about our accomplishments. When we do that, we need to challenge the more conventional notions of ethnic identity as something that's authentic and pure, social movements as something that are purely outside of institutional frameworks. We'd all like to think that. And also social institutions as exclusionary in an absolute sense. Now, here's the reason, by way of an ending. If we go looking for identity and diversity as things corresponding to exclusion, that is, as things that do not in fact define the totality, but rather the appearance of the exception, the exceptional, the tolerated, and the unmerited, then we have accepted a dominant framework that already mystifies its exclusions of some groups from recognition and redistribution. But if we supersize these concepts and make them apply to everyone, then we have begun to reframe our social analysis and cultural imagination. Thank you. And Renee.
I can be there if you operate this. Oh, okay. So I'm a filmmaker. I had to make it complicated. I've got QuickTime, 2 URLs, a PowerPoint, and notes, and I've got to be up here. And I'm nearsighted. So let's try to make this work. Thank you for inviting me here. Thanks, John, and thanks, Belinda. When Belinda asked me to be on this panel, one of the first things I did was go back to 1991 to an essay I actually wrote for the Asian American Studies Center. They published a book called Moving the Image about Asian American independent filmmaking. And I was tasked with summarizing the first 2 decades of Asian American cinema. It wasn't that long ago, but I lived through most of it. It was roughly the 1970s and 1980s. And the Asian American cinema, very much like early Chicano cinema, was what I call an intentional cinema. We functioned sort of as, well, not we, since the 1970s I was very, very young. I entered it around 1980. But Asian American filmmakers function as the cultural organ of the Asian American political identity movement. So Asian American filmmakers' mission was to construct that narrative of Asian American identity within the civil rights framework, largely within the civil rights framework. And we were influenced by national cinemas with the Third World, primarily by African American and Latino filmmakers. That was my name. But so I grew up with this whole kind of range of cultural influences, and that's always been embedded in my films. I know I made a film, as Chon said, called Who Killed Vincent Chin, which was about a civil rights case in Detroit, and it was full of Motown. Not only because Motown made sense for a story about Detroit, but because that's R&B and Motown and soul. That's the music I grew up with, and that music had a larger meaning for me because it was a time in the 1960s and 70s when, it's the go-go time in America. There was this sense of upward mobility and prosperity, and, I don't remember anybody's parent getting laid off during that time. And Who Killed Vincent Chin was, Vincent Chin himself was killed during the auto recession of the 1980s, and it really kind of signified the fracturing, the disruption of that upward kind of mobility and optimism. So Motown was really kind of this dissonant soundtrack for me in that film. So koto music, that whole, that's not what I grew up with. That's not really what I knew, and at a certain point as a filmmaker, I had to just own up to it. Well, my experience is very eclectic. It's a real hybrid experience. And I was thinking when I wrote the piece that really says something about the Asian American experience. Asian Americans grew up quite often in these very diverse kinds of locations. And at the time, in the 60s and 70s, because we were such a small minority, and as I said, for me, growing up as a smaller minority within this black-white binary, I pretty much picked a side, and I think that was a very common experience. So I wrote in that piece in 1991, Moving the Image, that I think we should embrace this kind of idea of the multiplicity, the cultural multiplicity of Asian American aesthetics. Something Tony Cade Bambara described in the patois that breaks through when something vital needs to be expressed. And Coco Fusco at the time was also writing about the Black British workshops, film workshops, which were Black and also South Asian. And she described kind of the eclectic cultural influences that shaped these filmmakers, which was very true of Asian American films. So this, what I call Super D, the Superdiversity, was percolating for a long time. Now, the 1990s was also a key moment because there was that disruption of this Asian American political identity, and I know I won't go over it again. For the past day, people have talked about, how the demographics and the greater kind of internal diversity has really changed things. There are more internal divisions within Asian America and with our historic allies, Latinos and African Americans, particularly like the Red Apple grocery store conflict in Brooklyn between Korean grocery store owners and African Americans, and of course the Latasha Harlins case here in Los Angeles. And as Asian American filmmakers, and I think just within the community as a whole, people who had been very active, was very uncomfortable dealing with these issues because they were our historic allies. There were fissures with new immigrant communities, and we were trying to figure out what's going on, what our identity meant as a result of all these changes. So I decided to figure it out. I made a film called My America, or Honkadoo Buddha, which I shot during the 1990s. Takes a long time to make a film. And it was a search for 5 minutes. You gotta be kidding me. I look like a 4-minute clip. Oh. Should I just play and fast forward?
No.
Okay. Belinda, was that for you, Belinda? Oh, she's
Yeah.
the boss. Oh, okay.
You've won her over.
But I still have like the past 20 years to get to. Okay,
There goes that glass of
so
wine,
this was a search for Asian American identity. So anyway, I'm going to play it. Okay. Go away, PowerPoint. Okay, here he is. This was one of my first stops was in New York with Mr. Choi, fortune cookie factory guy. In Chinatown, I meet a Mr. Choi, the 1990s version of Victor Wong's father.
Yeah.
Instead of MSG, Mr. Choi's dream is to corner the fortune cookie market everywhere from Boston to the Carolinas.
Oh, 點啊，大佬？落緊雨。
Mr. Choi is a man who doesn't waste any time.
係啊。
He keeps these calendars pinned to the wall, so there's no need to fiddle with time-consuming Rolodexes and phone books.
Sometimes I forget the phone number. I look at that phone number. I have a call. I don't look at the picture. I look at the phone number only.
Keeps so busy.
I want to make money. Couple years, I retire. That's it.
Where are you going?
I go to East Broadway. Now the price very cheap. You see the price yet? Buy 10 get 2 free.
Is that your lunch?
No dinner. That's my dinner, no lunch. Good for dinner.
Making money is a round-the-clock business for Mr. Choi. He's got a fortune cookie operation upstairs, and in the basement, he's selling fish. So I'm following him back and forth between the fortune cookies and the fish tanks. When finally, he's taking a break. But before I know it, we're off to somewhere in the Bronx.
Ready? Done.
Because Choi has a third job teaching martial arts. Then he gets on the phone to schedule his fourth job teaching back in Chinatown, but not before he tries to sell me the promotional calendars he markets as a sideline.
Cost you? How much you want to pay?
50 cents.
Forget about it. So I say you $5. Good? Hey, look, guys.
You can call Mr. Choi an immigrant role model, but for me, it's more like competing with Horatio Alger on amphetamines. Even on Chinese New Year's, guess who's doing security?
Okay, back up, please. Back up, please.
You know, some scientists believe Asians have a kind of super gene that we're able to work harder and delay immediate gratification. It's the bigger brains, smaller genitalia theory.
Surveys of the world literature show that Orientals are the most restrained, whether measured by intercourse frequencies, premarital, marital, or extramarital, reproductive speed, age of first intercourse, age of first pregnancy, or number of pregnancies per unit of time. Finding for cranial capacity, Orientals 1,448 cubic centimeters, whites 1,408 cubic centimeters, and blacks 1,334 cubic centimeters.
Okay, so on the surface, So on the surface, he's, Mr. Choi's a Chinese guy in Chinatown making fortune cookies. But if you unpack that sequence, he's actually Vietnamese Chinese. If you notice the workers in his fish factory, they were mostly undocumented workers from Mexico and Hong Kong. They lived in a little space next to the fish tanks. That piece of, over the fortune cookies, that voice you hear is Philippe Rushton, who was a social scientist from Canada, who did sort of this biological research. He would measure, of different races, measure cranial size and penis size. I mean, I'd like to see the IRB for that one. But so the film, it dealt with a lot of these things, again, percolating during that time. And one of the implicit ideas I was trying to get at, and I go all around the country and meet a lot of people, is what is the role, the social role of the Asian American in this post-civil rights era? Other than coming here for economic opportunity and making a better life for our families, what's our role in the public sphere? What's our role in terms of being engaged citizenry? So I'm going to try to go to the next 20 years very, very fast. But if I was asked to summarize the last 20 years, these last 2 decades in Asian American cinema, a lot of what was developing at that time we see really, really coming full circle. There's still many social justice filmmakers because of new technologies, youth, queer communities, new Asian communities have been able to make their own work. But there's also been a professionalization of Asian American filmmaking, as there has been in Asian American scholarship and in community grassroots organizations. They got 501c3s, scholars need to get tenure, Asian American filmmakers got deals, or they got PBS contracts, which kind of really changed the work and created this condition where we were all working in very specialized fields, so that original kind of 3 pillars and that collaborative work diminished to a great degree. Transnational feature filmmakers who are moving fluidly between Asia and the United States. That's something that's actually always been true, with very few exceptions. Most of the marketable feature filmmakers, Asian American filmmakers, have been immigrant filmmakers. Wayne Wong, Ang Lee, Mira Nair, very few American-born Asian American filmmakers have made that leap to feature filmmaking. I see. Are you raising your hand because you want me to stop? Oh, okay. Because during this time, Asian Americans have also faced, after these years of establishing our political identity as an oppressed minority, the whole idea of the rising Asian economies and also growing privilege in some sectors of the Asian American community. So we had to deal with this disruption in this identity of who we are, particularly in relation to other communities of color. So Asian Americans started to get into elite schools in great numbers, and including film schools. So you had figures like Justin Lin, who is actually, I think is, really represents the whole range of Asian American filmmaking during these last 20 years. If I can go back to my PowerPoint there. That's not him. Justin started working for Bob Nakamura at the Japanese American National Museum, making community videos about Japanese American community. Then he broke out at Sundance with Better Luck Tomorrow, which is a satire, a breakout feature. And then now he sort of owns, as a director, the Fast and Furious franchise. And more recently, he started a YouTube channel called You Offend Me, You Offend My Family. And the whole idea is bringing in this diverse talent of talent of color, not only Asian Americans, and giving them a platform to do their work. Now, a lot of Asian Americans, very interestingly, have circumvented the glass ceiling that still exists in Hollywood by going on YouTube. Ryan Higa, Kev Jumba are two examples. And they're not just Asian American YouTube celebrities. I mean, they have among the most hits of any talent on YouTube. That's something that my colleague Ellis Kim from Santa Cruz has written about and has really done a lot of thinking about. So there are all these different, so the Asian American cinema, I would say in the last 20 years has really gone the way of the Asian American community. Like all these different social factors really kind of have come together in terms of the cinema. So the question is, looking at Justin's work, looking at the new work, does that constitute an Asian American cinema? Does it constitute an Asian American cinema where there's no longer this kind of intentional cinema that started in the 1970s? Just to conclude, I would say that, let 100 flowers bloom, or is it 1,000 flowers? Just let it bloom. I think it's great. Pardon me?
A whole bunch of flowers.
A whole bunch of flowers. I think it's great that there are all these genres and people are entering the media from many different points. At the same time, I would propose that right now is a relevant time to bring back this kind of coalition, this collaboration of Asian American filmmakers, scholars, and activists. I think that the time is ripe, one, just technologically. There is, knowledge is now being produced and disseminated digitally and visually, and it's an apt time to produce more work that is embedded in scholarship, embedded in community activism. We always used to, as filmmakers, tell scholars when they complained about, oh, your film doesn't have complexity, et cetera, well, you can't footnote a film. But in fact, you can now footnote a film. Very quickly, this is 18 Days in Egypt. So this is a crowdsourced interactive web project, and people in Tahrir Square and people who are involved with the activism in Egypt would send in videos of things that they saw, and then these videos are tagged. You can go to an Al Jazeera report, you can go to text that has more information about what was going on the bridge, etc. And you can do that with a film. You can show a film and literally footnote the film with layers and layers of knowledge and information. So that's something where I see that scholars can really, really be involved in that kind of production. In terms of new mobile devices, you can take a cell phone, let's say, if you're researching environmental racism and working around those issues, the cell phone can collect data. It can record data. It can record people's stories, which can become hearts and minds films. And through networking, you can reach people to come to a rally, come to a protest, to kind of come together around the issue. So there are a lot of different possibilities with the new technologies. So I would say, in moving forward, I hope that we can, within the academy and within our communities, can, use us, filmmakers, work with us, and find a way to, I think we have that imperative right now because of the rising inequality, marshal all our resources and work together. So, sorry for going over time.
I would have given you my time, actually. And I'm a huge fan of Who Killed Vincent Chin. That's a very, very important film, like a groundbreaking political film. Everyone needs to see it. Okay, let me be very, very quick. First of all, thank everyone who put this conference together. It's been amazing, it's been excellent. And I have to say that I've been to a lot of conferences lately that have been terrible. I mean, just really uninteresting. So that kind of jacked me up. Now, I have to say very quickly, I had a little intervention I wanted to make earlier it's 90 seconds, and that is when we're talking about deportation and exclusion. One of the things I just want to remind us, a little historical footnote, that deportation and exclusion, particularly in the early 20th century, was not simply about sort of race and ethnicity or even shoring up working class support, but it was a tool by the state to suppress radical movements. We have to remember that in that period, the Espionage Act, anti-sedition, criminal syndicalism, those were directed at immigrants on the assumption that immigrants bring with them radical politics, which they do. And so, Ricardo Flores Magón was jailed under the Espionage Act of 1917. Remember, the United States is one of those few major countries that had a major world historical revolution on its borders. Let's not forget that. So there really were anarchists and socialists and radicals and social democrats coming into the country. And so there was a kind of logic to that. Also read the McCarran-Walter Immigration and Naturalization Act. That is about anti-communism. It tightened and expanded political exclusions, made it easier to deport people on the suspicion that they harbored seditious ideas and unpatriotic values. And in fact, they had a 10-year sort of frame that if you were naturalized within 10 years, you could still be deported. And Pat McCarran himself said, look, Operation Wetback, 1954, which was Eisenhower's national security doctrine, was to stop communist agents from coming across Mexico. So just remember that there's a politics, because all over the globe, deportation, exclusion, and even in the United States of America, is also about political denial. And I want to say that to sort of support, because I thought Professor Bali made this brilliant presentation, and I think the implications of what she was arguing, we couldn't get into it as much. So let me just get on to my talk. And I have to first apologize because those of you who know me know that I don't read my emails until like months later. So I wasn't paying attention, and I kind of knew about this conference, and I knew I was in it. I didn't know what I was doing. And it was this morning that I realized that I was on a panel about cultural production. I thought I was going to talk about post-civil rights and that sort of thing. And as Kaylani knows, I don't do social media. She knows that. So I can't talk about social media. So I decided that's what I had to leave after lunch to sort of put together a talk, because I didn't want to lie and say I wasn't talking about sort of cultural production. So I'm gonna talk about that. And let me tell you, first of all, a few caveats. One, what I know about the entertainment industry, I know through my amazing wife, Lisa Gay Hamilton, and she doesn't experience diversity of any kind, super or otherwise. What she experiences is unemployment. And in fact, she hasn't worked in 2 years. She goes to auditions to play yet another police captain. She sees the same black women on these auditions all the time. It is tragic. And what she does see in Superdiversity is the tendency to actually hire black Brits to play African American roles, which is interesting. And they're brilliant actors coming out of theater. But the point is that she's not working. She doesn't like to leave the house for that reason. I wanted her to come today, but she's so depressed about this. This is Hollywood, okay? Now, let me just begin with some general observations about the limits of a kind of superdiversity framework absent an interrogation of power. We already heard brilliant critiques of how essential it is to pay attention to racialization, to empire, to inequality, and political mobilization. All these are expressions of power. But just consider what it means, for example, to talk about the superdiversity of the supermax prison, right? Which is super diverse. Or the fact that one of the super diversity sort of world historical spaces was apartheid South Africa, right? So again, what I really appreciate about the conference is that people keep coming back to the question of power. That is the fundamental question, the question of power. So I want to build on this issue of power by reflecting on a few recent films. I'm not a film scholar. I don't pretend to be. I have opinions, and I'm going to share them with you. So. A couple sort of general points. One is the diversity, kind of multiculturalism discourse, often compels us to pay more attention to bodies on the screen rather than ideologies that are being perpetuated or reproduced. And so diversity, super or not, is employed to convey, particularly recently, but not just recently, it's just been the whole history of film, incredibly conservative, reactionary stories, narratives that mirror our neoliberal political culture. And that's not new, but I want to just point to a few very recent examples. Of course, we have these Islamophobic films such as Zero Dark 30, that no matter how much the producers, the director, the lead actor tells you otherwise, it is a film that justifies and legitimizes torture. That is the project, okay? And it comes out of left Hollywood. So the idea of left Hollywood to me is just such a myth. You know, they may raise money for Obama and complain about him, but certainly they got their president, the one who uses drone strikes in ways that that are shocking. Okay, Argo, of course, which rewrites history in the service of the war on terror and prepares us for an assault on Iran, either from Israel or from the United States. We'll see. It never addresses the real fact that the US, through the CIA, overthrew the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and installed the Shah. That part of the story kind of explains why Iranians are kind of pissed at the United States. But you know, it doesn't matter. So whereas the anti-Muslim and anti-Iranian films have actually gotten some pushback, which I appreciate, some, not much. The films allegedly depicting American slavery and race, and here we're talking about the kind of biracial stories, have been celebrated as truth-telling in a kind of post-racial age. So we have Django Unchained, which is incredibly popular with a lot of people whose opinions I respect. And for me, its racial politics were so painful, as I wrote in my note to myself, worse than Massa Lincoln, you know. I'm sorry about that. And I think Tarantino's one of those like closet hipster racist guys. Yes. This is my own position. And of course, I'd love to write an article called "What's the Matter with Black People?" because they love this film, Django Untrained. It's the same thing. Anyway, so this is Quentin Tarantino's black fantasy, black exploitation film. Jamie Foxx is a kind of a cartoon character. Who's a fine actor. My wife played opposite him, you know. But he plays a cartoon character stripped of any complexity or humanity. He's just a stud who wants to save his wife because she not a field nigger, she pretty. All the black men, except for Django, are passive and scared. All the black women are happy, hypersexual, and talk and look like they've had lobotomies. The violence and brutality is so over the top that it's numbing, and it actually has the opposite effect of making slavery a lot less brutal and dehumanizing than it really is. Because obviously, if there are no humans, you can't dehumanize, right? Because there are no humans in that film. The white people are essentially evil except for the German bounty hunter who trains and befriends Django, and of course, he's the smartest one in the whole film. Tarantino is clearly trying to combine films like Sweet Sweetback with Burn, the radical film starring Marlon Brando as an Englishman who foments a slave revolt on some fictional Haiti-like island. 1969, it's a great film, by the way. The difference is that in Sweetback, whatever the critique, the protagonist is transformed by a community willing to protect him as he takes flight from the law. In Burn, the white man who trained the leader of the revolt, and the purpose of the revolt, of course, was basically to end slavery, to produce free labor, and for the penetration of capital. That was Brando's plan. He gets killed. You know, they take him out, which I think is great. So there's nothing redemptive like this in Django. There's no community, no revolutionary transformation, and in the end, it is a movie about white people and white fantasy. And we learn that Tarantino believes, and I really do think he believes this, that the racial phrenologist, if you've seen the film, who suggests that there are 1 in 10,000 Negroes equipped with intelligence and drive. I mean, that Tarantino actually believes that, and that Django, in fact, is that 1 in 10,000, right? Which is pretty interesting. I mean, it's great to hear Philip Rushton, which writes all this racist stuff. I mean, basically, it's the same. It's a modern version of that. And I won't go into Kerry Washington's Sniveling Damsel or Sam Jackson's Groveling Uncle Tom, but that's another story. We'll get into it. The last, because time is short, I just want to just pay a little bit more attention to one other film, not from this year, but from last year, but I think it's worth talking about, and that is The Help, which, by the way, my wife did not go in for. She didn't audition for that film. She was like, you know, protesting. Like all those Hollywood civil rights era films, it never places African Americans at the center of the story. Their own agency is always sparked by good liberal white characters. Instead, these films, like Mississippi Burning and others, center on a redeeming white character with whom the audience can identify, and therefore never have to confront their own complicity in perpetuating racism, especially since racism in these films is always sinister, evil, melodramatic, and in the past. White viewers can take the journey into the Deep South without ever having to feel uncomfortable. And actually, even this formulation of like the white protagonist has undergone a revision with, in some forms of cultural production, with the movement actually playing a smaller and smaller role and politicians being elevated as their real heroes. So if you've seen the play by Robert Schenken, award-winning play All the Way, it's about how LBJ single-handedly ushered in civil rights legislation by himself. And King comes up in the play, but as basically, hounding white women in the Oval Office, as if LBJ wasn't hounding those women, right? Anyway, and then of course we see Lincoln, which is a version of that. Of where, in other words, the politician is elevated, the movement really plays no role at all. Now, The Help, in this kind of so-called post-racial context, is a narrative about how racism ended. That's what it's about. It's about the end of racism. The film's message is clear. Proper education and exposure, hence our liberal heroine, Skeeter, combined with a strong moral compass, that is the black maids, can overcome racism and potentially sexism. But what did these black women overcome? By the film's end, black maids are still poorly paid and exploited. The rich white folks occupy the estates financed by generations of slave labor. The character Eula May, Ingenue Ellis, enjoys her comeuppance from a crowded prison cell. She's in prison and she's in jail. She's like, oh, right, yeah, they got him. You're not getting out anytime soon, sister. Really? And then Minnie triumphantly learns, in what must be the strangest feel-good moment in movie history, that she has a job as a low-wage domestic, quote, for the rest of your life. Hooray. Only Abilene, played by Viola Davis, is able to walk away. In other words, despite the character Skeeter's ability to publish the maid's stories, power relationships between domestics and employers, black and white, do not fundamentally change. Absent an understanding of power, audience then can leave the film believing that racism really is a product of evil or ignorant individuals, and that the women's victory is in telling their story, in exposing bad employers, and acknowledging the good ones, recovering their sense of dignity as if they lost it, right? We don't see racism as a system and an ideology enabling even the kindest, most guilt-ridden employers to pay low wages, provide no benefits, fire employees at will, and in many cases, turn a blind eye to the frequent sexual abuse of black maids. Now, of course, acknowledging the help as exploited workers within a complex racial hierarchy should make viewers recognize the Latinas, the Filipinas, the South and Southeast Asian and Caribbean women who clean homes and care for children. And what's one of the great ironies about the film and the Academy Award nominations is that the National Domestic Workers Alliance, which Abel mentioned, very important organization, they waged a militant struggle at this right around the time of the Academy Awards to back a California Domestic Workers Bill of Rights. And what they tried to do was, we actually organized a big fundraiser for them. They tried to draw on the popularity of the help in order to mobilize support for the campaign. In other words, the campaign was built around the idea that this is the real help. And it's amazing how many people of those 94% white Academy members, how many of those people actually employ domestic workers, as you so brilliantly began your presentation? Actually real domestic workers who don't make the connection at all between who they're paying and exploiting in their lives and the celebration of the help as a feel-good movie. Now, why is that? Well, part of it is that by constructing the Jim Crow South as a region of memory, right? It becomes as distant as the era of slavery. In fact, it gets collapsed in the era of slavery, as if it's all this region of memory. And it undercuts efforts to link these histories of domestic labor in struggle. And of course, we know the story that the bill did pass, but it was killed by Governor Brown's veto. Finally, just to conclude, our impoverished understanding of race has led both critics and defenders to assume that the film is primarily about black women. But just like Django, it's not about black women. The help is about white people and the fragility of white identity so dependent on black subordination. It's not about the help, but what they represent in a world where the myths of white supremacy have begun to crumble. For this reason, it's a shame that the book and the film chose caricatures to stand in for the evils of white racism and the redemptive qualities of enlightened white liberalism, rather than render complex characters struggling to become human. I'm talking about the white people. The struggles to become human beings under the crushing power of white supremacy. And I mean that, and that wasn't a mistake. That white people are trying to become human under the crushing power of white supremacy. And of course, in their narrative, they turn to black people to sort of both justify their claims to humanity and to be sort of the role model to remake themselves, but they're trying to become human. But doing this would mean acknowledging that race is not the personal domain of black people, but the lived experience of all. Thank you.
Good evening. And it is evening, and I have to commend all of you. Friday evening, and you're here listening to me. I respect you tremendously, and I'm going to try to do justice to the phenomenal day of presentations that I have had the privilege to hear, and I know that last night with the opening there were even more presentations that I wasn't able to join for. And I want to just say from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for bringing me back to UCLA. I think in the introduction I said keep it short, but the really important thing is I am a double graduate of UCLA, did my undergrad American Indian Studies, and then did my law degree here. And there is a powerful intellectual tradition in this room. I congratulate you guys. I'm so proud to be here. And the other thing is, I'm just so relieved to be here because I live in Arizona. And you guys saw that picture of our governor greeting our president. That's my daily life in Arizona. And it's always confrontational. And I've been sitting here thinking that listening to all of you was like listening to the most beautiful symphony where all the notes connected up and the chorus was there, and then there were new sounds and feelings, and I thought, wow, I haven't experienced that for so long. And so I'm really, really grateful. And I know that our time is short together. So in the spirit of respect, and also I commend my colleagues who spoke the name of the Tongva people into our circle here. And that's how it happens. There is a beginning, and the people acknowledge that. That's the opening in the traditional protocols. The last position in the traditional protocols is what I think a very hard one, because you can't just grandstand about yourself or your theories or what you think, but you really have to do justice to the spirit of what has been said into the space. And there were some very powerful presentations that I'm going to link up into in my brief comments, and I'm not going to read the paper, and if it doesn't make any sense, our timekeeper is going to give me a wave, and I'm going to sit down, and everybody's going to enjoy, I think, refreshments. But before I do that, let me just say, how many people actually did know that this was the traditional land of the Tongva people? That's outstanding. That is outstanding. How many people saw Gwen Stefani's performance in the video for her band, No Doubt, that was called Looking Hot, before they pulled it off of the line? Ah, very good. How many people have seen those awful westerns they still play on weird channels late at night, where there's like some poor group of settlers and then there's some really horrible Indians and even more. Okay. So would it be safe to say that we do have a shared kind of collective conscience or consciousness, those are two different things, right? About the presence of Native people on these lands. And I think that that, to me, is the really significant thing about what we're talking about on this panel, cultural production through media. And I'm totally sympathetic. I don't know how to do Facebook, and I don't read my email for months and months and months. But you know what? We're the true minority in this room, right? You guys all have smartphones and social media, and you guys connect instantly. And the power of images and films, such as what you showed, and I really love your films. Oh my gosh, those are fantastic. The power of those images to convey knowledge about people and places instantly and to link people up, that is very, very powerful. So it is a very fitting topic for our last consideration. If that's where the power is, who's going to be manipulating that power? And why are they going to be doing that? I think that the conversation that I've heard here about superdiversity has certainly enlightened me about the possibility. And so what I want to do in the time that I have with you is to think consecutively about our journey together over the day when we were thinking about the topic of superdiversity and connect it up to the idea of an emerging consciousness around that. And I take it that from our standpoint, that consciousness would have an agency, would have a power, and with the numbers, wherever those sites are, place, location, population, that there is going to be something powerful that emerges, that is going to transform the nature of our world and our society. How many people believe that? I believe that. That is what is going to happen. It's just a question of who's going to do it. And so that's what I want to think with you about today. When I was preparing for this conference, I didn't really understand, and thank you so much, Devin Carbano, for giving me that little nudge, and thank you so much to Angela Riley for kind of backing that up, because I thought, I really don't know if I can pull this off, because I don't know what that term means. And when I started to research it, and I read Vertovik's work, I too shared that idea. Well, if he's talking about Great Britain and diversity in Great Britain, what does that have to do with the things that I care about and work on for Indigenous peoples? And what I saw is that concept, the way that he was constructing it, had its origins way back when Britain was thinking about what would happen with inviting new groups to their land. See, it was okay for them to go to everybody else's land. But what would happen if people came to their land? What was their identity? And how would that be impacted? And I really thought that was interesting, because he said, well, way back in the 19th century, that's when they started to talk about this thing called cosmopolitanism in London. And then they started to think about, oh no, what was that going to do? To the kind of the populist mentality of who we are as the British people. And what does that mean? And I saw that mentality really replicated itself in the intellectual lineage that underlies all of what we're talking about, the law, epistemology, right? Because it is that idea of Western liberal society and John Stuart Mill's work that we can have this secular society built on a neutral principle of liberty. And there's one little page in there. I know Kalani's read this. Now, one little page that says, oh, but those other people, like the primitive people, the people who really don't have our rationality, we really don't have to worry about them. We can think for them, and we can invite them into this world when they're ready for civilization. That was the notion. So it really isn't a surprise to me to think about the context of that discourse today. That now that we are moving into what some people have termed, here, the settler colonialism, that was about the project of nationalism, building a national identity for the United States. Well, what happens to the multiple indigenous nations? And our colleague Dwayne Champagne, one of my professors, he's talked about multinationalism in the context of indigenous governments, to make those present and on a position of equal respect. They're afraid to do that in Hawaii. Multinationalism is really dangerous in Hawaii for all the reasons that Kalani spoke about. So it really is a project of their tolerance for how far they allow other nationalisms to perpetuate. Of course, they're all okay with culture. They like culture. In fact, the more they can appropriate from culture, the better for them, right? That's the context of multiculturalism, and diversity is part of that. So when Vertovec talked about that in his other work, I saw that as another strand. I said, oh, okay, that's what they're doing. They're managing us by managing culture in ways that work for them. Now, to the extent that race becomes linked up to culture, it gets a little scary, right? Because what's going to happen to equal citizenship? And that conversation in the Supreme Court is really, it's very illustrative of that. So the idea is we have a common collective culture, and we really don't have to worry about things that balkanize. And that's why tribal and indigenous cultures are so distressing, because tribalism is a destabilizing force, or is perceived to be destabilizing, and that is true the world over. And partly, I think in the context of the work that's coming out on indigenous human rights, that really it is very powerful because it is trans-border peoples that are implicated. Indigenous peoples as peoples have a right to self-determination. They are trans-border identities, and that is going to be a very powerful thread for us to examine, because they're not necessarily localized within nation states in total. So I want to move from that idea, and Kalani did such a good job with kind of indigeneity, that I want to move to what the linkages are between indigenous peoples and other groups, because I think that is very, very important. Indigenous peoples are speaking the language of self-determination now, because it is a more powerful language about autonomous control over territory, culture, economics, social organization than the concept of sovereignty has been. Sovereignty has been limited domestically in ways that are not of our choosing, but we are limited by those frameworks. And so self-determination allows us to language that. Now, is self-determination consistent with superdiversity, or is it antithetical? Are they in conflict with each other? And so I wanted to think about that, and I invite you to think about that with me, just briefly, some ideas that I had about that. And here I'm drawing on some work, in terms of what the themes are that kind of butt heads with each other, if you will. And so they're clusters of these. The first one is the divides that we have, and these are obviously English terms, in terms of ethnicity, religion, and culture, right? Groupings can be any of those things or all of those things, but the rights that accrue are different, and even whether we recognize them are different. Do we even recognize the right to culture in the United States? How many people think yes? No, you guys are too smart. You guys are smart. We don't. Do we recognize the right to religion? Somewhat, like maybe there's something in the Constitution that says religion. Of course, it doesn't work in a rights framework, and so you guys are skeptical. But at least there's a word in there. What about ethnicity? No, that's not there. Okay, so those are very powerful ideas for me, because as I have witnessed the sort of work that I've done, indigenous self-determination is built around indigenous governance, which in its traditional forms is oftentimes very integrated functionally. So there isn't that separation between religion and secular things, and so it's co-joined. That's why it's so hard to fight for a sacred rights claim in the First Amendment jurisprudence. It just doesn't work. But I really saw that the effort of forcible assimilation was premised around secular values. We are going to civilize you. And that's why we can take your kids, that's why we can take your cultural objects, that's why we can ban your religions, because all of that was done under the law, because it's a secular project of civilization. But the means to get there was Christianity, because the Christian missionaries were assigned out to the reservations as Indian agents. And so they actually brokered the cultural assimilation into the dominant set of values, which is heavily premised on that. And I'm talking about Christianity as a term politically, not in the sense of any faith that might be in this room, because I have respect for you, but the political use of Christianity and then the denial of that is a problem for Native people, because now we have to go into the US Supreme Court and fight for culture under the rubric, the label of religion. And there is a profound injustice in that. Second theme I want to interrogate is that whole idea of cosmopolitanism and diversity. And how does that even link up to equal citizenship? And why should we care about it? Well, here's why to care about it. And if you read the work of liberal scholars who actually are supportive of indigenous rights, group rights, because not all of them are. But if you read those like Kimlicka that are, they're making the point that there is a value to individual people in having them be secure in their cultural context. So you don't want their cultures destroyed. There is a powerful counterweight to that, and it is in the theory of cosmopolitanism. And Jeremy Waldron's work on that is very, very powerful. So he actually says that any claim of indigenous peoples that they need to live in their cultural context is an artificial claim, because we in our modern identities are cosmopolitan people who pick and choose from all these different array of cultures. And media, film, is an example of that we should be free, he says, to choose from all those cultural symbols and create new cultures and transform old cultures. We don't want to be locked down into it. My students are very persuaded by Waldron's work. They love it. The young ones, they love the freedom that he is espousing. But the counterweight to that is he is arguing against any rights to control culture. And so I really commend my colleague Angela Riley, who wrote a letter, really powerful letter to that record company about the Gwen Stefani film before they pulled it. And she really made that point, that Native peoples have been fixed in this terrible primitive past where their bodies are exploited, their land is exploited, and somehow those images are replicated by young people in these cool, trendy videos, and you can see numerous examples of that. So the scholars like Michael Brown say, well, there's no right to control culture. You can't control culture. And P.S., cultures don't have rights. Nations have rights. Individuals have rights. Corporations, they really do have rights, even the right to speak. But not cultures. And there is some truth to that. As we link up this project of superdiversity, if there is a global Asian consciousness, Latino consciousness, Native consciousness, who owns that? Who manages it? Who controls it? So for Native peoples, those are very, very important interests. And that idea of equal citizenship, having worked through these eras of exclusion and then forcible inclusion, subordination, to now this status of domestic dependent nation, which the Hawaiian people are wise to say, what exactly is that? But that really is insufficient. The idea of equality of peoples is the equality that indigenous people seek. And that is something that has not been afforded yet. The UN declaration is a first step, but it's just a declaration. What would it take for the US to sign on to that? In the last part of what I want to say, I really want to think with you about the idea of cultural identity as pivotal to self-determination. It is that right of a people to define itself. And Carol Goldberg, my colleague and professor from a long time, has written this wonderful study of the Tule River tribe, Defying All Odds, with Galia Frank, where she discusses the Tule River tribe through time. Just as the Tongva people were original people, they're original people, sometimes recognized, sometimes not recognized politically by other governments, but they continue, they thrive, because they know who they are. They have that core identity. And that is what sustains indigenous peoples through generations. That is the linkage, the epistemology that Kalani is talking about. It is intergenerational. And we respect and honor those ancestors by remembering them and speaking them into the space. That requires the cultural knowledge. And sometimes that requires closing that culture to others, including the manipulation of it. All of those movies, all of those themes that you know that depict the savage, the noble savage or just the savage, the environmental Indian, the gaming baron who doesn't even respect his culture, the mystical Indian who all he can do is live his culture, all of those images are in our minds. And I loved Professor Kong's presentation where he kind of said, you know, all that junk that's in your mind that you don't know is there, well, it's there. And it drives a lot of what happens in the daily lives of us who are living today. What is it going to do for our children? And the last image, I just thought this was so amazing that this student sent this to me. I have a group of wonderful students at ASU, and there's some Native students and there's some non-Native students, and they've all coalesced into this art movement. And their opening of their show was tonight. And I told them, well, I can't be there, but I want to hear all about it. But basically their theme is what tribe? And the images that they have created from their various cultural senses, they're cross borders, cross a lot of borders. Those borders didn't exist for our ancestors. And in our consciousness, they don't exist either. Thank you so much.
So Belinda, how much time do we have for Q&A?
10 minutes.
Sure, 10 minutes. So any questions, comments? Toast.
Y'all done good.
Oh, well, thank you. Any more like that? Okay, we have one back there.
Have to do the mic thing. Hi, everybody. My name is May, and I come from across the freeway. I went to UCLA, though, as an undergrad. When I was listening to you all, I was thinking about the Oscars as performing spectacle. Robin, you've been talking about spectacle in politics as well. And it's so interesting because this Oscars did encapsulate everything you were talking about. The Asian immigrant winning the Best Director title, and then you also had, you know, obviously you talked about the celebration of Django, but I thought it was so fascinating that why was there a decision to have the First Lady of the United States give the award for Best Film? Once I saw that with her military detail, I was like, it's got to be Argo, you know? And I want you to possibly speak more on this idea of the white hipster racist, not just to Seth MacFarlane, but as somebody consuming what they're seeing with the visibility and the invisibility of certain groups that we were talking about, but also, I don't know if you all are aware of what happened with the Onion's comment, satirical comment with, forgot her name from Beasts of the Southern Wild. But basically, this 9-year-old who was nominated for Best Actress Award was called a C word. And that came about during the Oscar broadcast. So I was just really interested in the idea of this as spectacle related to empire, you know? And just wanted you to talk about more on that.
I guess any of us could. I would agree. This last Oscar seemed to be the most mean-spirited one addressed to women and racial minorities or majorities, depending on what part of the country you look at. And the Onion comments, what was reassuring in a sense was the way in which that got folded into the show itself in the critiques that were almost instantaneous. The people understood that what the Onion was doing was not satirical, but also that it was directly related to what the program itself was doing. The other thing, which didn't get mentioned as much, is that the Oscars were essentially a 3.5-hour advertisement for the producer who did Chicago, who's doing a smash, I guess. And so the kind of marketing aspect of it was tied in with what, I feel is a stupid miscalculation about the attempt to broaden the demographics for the viewership, which is to go younger. And what they didn't realize is that when you go younger, you really go, in a sense, a much more racially diverse, white minority, people that are very versed in social media, and in which a lot of the interactional elements that kind of are codified around racism and the response to racism are fundamentally different. And what we ended up with was a show aimed at younger people that looked almost exactly like the Dean Martin comedy roast, which I've been watching obsessively on YouTube and finding in some ways infinitely more honest than a lot of what happens in the media now. But it is another time. It is 40 years ago. And the racial dynamics and the overt racism under the rubric of this is hip, that's not now, that's 40 years ago. That was the framework for it. And at that time, at least, to the credit of that, when you look at the Dean Martin comedy roast, you see a lot of black people, Latino, Asian people, up there, and you see the ability for them to talk to each other, even if they're kind of hurling insults. And what you saw, I think, in the Oscars was the masquerade of that. So that, yeah, we had somebody who's African-American win one of the top awards. It was Quentin Tarantino. We had somebody who portrayed a Latino win for Best Producer. It was Ben Affleck. Ang Lee was really the only person that, in some ways, was representing the group that he was signaling. So, any other questions? Or any other comments from the speakers?
I didn't either.
Yeah, I'm not watching them again.
My question's open to all panelists, but especially for the last panelist. When you said that cultural identity and self-determination allowed tribes to still thrive even under extremely oppressive conditions, but my question is for like generations that don't really have that cultural identity, where they can't really identify with even their own cultures, because sometimes you're even told you kind of have to distance yourself from that in order to be accepted into mainstream society. So what happens also when you have these like images in media, these mainstream views on how you should even act, even ignoring your own culture. So what happens when you don't have that? How do you even thrive in similar conditions as these tribes did?
Here you go.
That's a really great question. One of the exercises I actually did with I have an undergraduate class for the first time, and I actually was talking about Native issues and culture, and I could tell that they were having a hard time. So I went around the room and I asked them if they felt that they had a culture. And it was very interesting because the ones who identified as typical American, their family had been here forever or whatever, they didn't feel like they had a culture unless it was something that they affirmatively wanted to adopt, like some practice that Buddhism or something that their partner wanted them to do. They didn't feel like they particularly had one. The young people who were from immigrant families all of them said they had a culture, but they were in various states of distress, either because they couldn't speak the language and therefore couldn't talk to their relatives, or they didn't really have enough understanding, or that they were being affirmatively counseled by their parents who had been through the citizenship classes, like, please do not even signal that you have that culture, otherwise you're not going to get the job, blah, blah, blah. And so what I took from that is that that enterprise of nation building for a state like the United States is to homogenize everybody into the one, and then who is the one, as somebody said today, right? In that way, the difference is the other, which is always going to be one down. And that's what I see in Arizona, very sadly. I see that the other is always one down, and it doesn't matter how many degrees they have behind their name. They are one down. That's the power of turning that around, because that is a set of lies. That is a set of lies. I just love that old quote by Louis Riel, the Métis leader from the 19th century. It was at the end of the wars there, and he just said, you know, okay, he said, my people are going to be asleep for 100 years, but when they wake up, it's the artists that are going to do it and give them their voice back. And so, thank you for asking that question.
So I think we have time for one more question. Mary Sue, was that you raising your hand? Okay, so all other questions and laudatory statements will be done over a glass of wine just outside the door here. I want to thank you all, and it's been a great day.
I want to just take a few more minutes to thank all of our speakers. If we could get one round of applause for all our speakers. All of our moderators and all of the staff who put this on. And I think the one last comment that I would make is that it's clear, and somebody said this earlier today, that ethnic studies is a political project. You know, 4 ethnic study centers that have been together, working together for nearly 50 years, put this on. We have entered a new era. We are embarking on a new journey. And I think that in and of itself says a whole lot about Super D. So thank you for coming and staying with us.